At 83, my hands shake when I pour my morning coffee, but they tremble even more when I think about that night in Wilson, North Carolina. Most people my age talk about their grandchildren, their garden, maybe their aches and pains. But me? I'm finally ready to talk about the family that tried to destroy me before I even had a chance to live. You know, there's this moment that happens in every abused child's life. That split second when you realize the people who brought you into this world, or in my case, the people who took you in, would rather see you gone than face what they've done to you. For me, that moment came when I heard my mother Margaret scream those 4 words that still haunt my dreams. "Stop, the police are here." I was lying on that cold living room floor, my 5 brothers standing over me like they'd done so many times before, when those sirens started wailing outside our house. And for just a heartbeat, one foolish, hopeful heartbeat, I thought my mother was finally going to protect me. I thought she was telling them to stop hurting me because help had arrived. But I was wrong, dead wrong. Those words weren't meant to save me. They were meant to save them. Every single one of them. Because you see, when you've spent years perfecting the art of family cruelty, when you've turned child abuse into a well-oiled machine, the last thing you want is witnesses. The last thing you want is consequences. My name is Candace, and this is the story I've kept buried for 76 years. This is the story of how a 7-year-old girl learned that monsters don't hide under beds. Sometimes they sit at your dinner table, sometimes they tuck you in at night, and sometimes they call themselves your family. But it's also the story of how truth has a way of crawling out of even the deepest graves, and how justice, even when it arrives decades late, can still taste sweet. So buckle up, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, about protection, and about the lengths people will go to keep their darkest secrets buried. Wilson, North Carolina in the 1942nd, was the kind of place where everyone out for each other's children. Or at least, that's what it was supposed to be like. But inside the walls of our little house on Elm Street, a different kind of story was unfolding. One that would teach me that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who share your last name. Harold found me when I was just 3 years old, a scared little thing who'd already seen more heartbreak than most adults. He scooped me up like I was made of gold, brought me home, and told everyone I was his daughter. Not his adopted daughter, not his stepdaughter, his daughter, period. When people at church or at the grocery store would whisper questions about where I came from, Harold would just smile and say, "She's mine now, and that's all that matters." But Margaret? Margaret looked at me like I was a stray dog Harold had dragged in from the rain. From the very first day I walked through that front door, her eyes held something I was too young to recognize then, but understand all too well now. Pure, undiluted hatred. She'd smile when Harold was watching, pat my head, even braid my hair sometimes. But the moment he turned his back, those hands would tighten just a little too much. Those fingers would find the soft spots that bruise easily, and she'd whisper things in my ear that no child should ever hear. "You don't belong here," she'd hiss while brushing my hair so hard my scalp burned. "You never will." Harold was my shield, my protector, my proof that love could exist in this world. When he came home from his job at the tobacco warehouse, dirt under his fingernails and exhaustion in his bones, his whole face would light up when he saw me. He'd sweep me up in those strong arms and spin me around until I squealed with laughter. He taught me to ride a bicycle, helped me with my arithmetic, and every night before bed, he'd sit on the edge of my mattress and tell me stories about brave little girls who conquered dragons. But then, when I was 8 years old, Harold's heart gave out. Just stopped beating one Tuesday morning while he was drinking his coffee and reading the newspaper. One minute he was there, solid and real and mine, and the next minute he was gone, leaving me alone with a woman who'd been counting the days until she could show me exactly how she really felt. The funeral was on a Thursday. I remember that because I kept thinking how Harold always said Thursday was his lucky day. The day he'd found me, the day he'd gotten his job, the day he'd married Margaret. But there was nothing lucky about watching them lower his casket into the ground while Margaret stood beside me, not crying, not even pretending to grieve, just waiting. That night, after the neighbors had gone home and the casseroles had been put away, Margaret sat me down at our kitchen table and said the words that would change everything. "Things are going to be different now, Candace. Very different." And she was right. Because that's when my real family showed their true faces. My 5 brothers who'd learned their mother's lessons well, and Margaret herself, who was finally free to treat me exactly the way she'd always wanted to. The abuse didn't start gradually. It didn't build up slowly over time. It crashed down on me like a tidal wave the moment Harold's protection was buried 6 feet underground. I want to thank you, my dear friends who are watching me now. Tell me in the comments, which town are you watching from? And what time of the day did you find this video? Are you having your morning coffee or exercise? Or perhaps resting after lunch? Or just chilling in your bedroom at night? Or are you like me who likes to watch my little ones before bed? I always read all the comments, and I'm so happy to know where you're from, and when you take out time to listen to this grandma's stories, and please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because our voice matters. Those early years with Harold were like living in 2 different worlds that existed in the same house. During the day, when Harold was at the tobacco warehouse, I lived in Margaret's world, a cold, colorless place where I was invisible at best, despised at worst. But when that front door creaked open at 5:30 every evening and I heard Harold's work boots on the wooden floor, I'd run to him like he was my salvation. And in many ways, he was. Margaret had this way of making me disappear without actually making me leave. She'd set the dinner table for 6 people. Her, Harold, and my 5 brothers, Samuel, Peter, Victor, Lawrence, and Daniel. But somehow, there was never a plate for me. When Harold would notice and ask where my place setting was, Margaret would sigh dramatically and say, "Oh, I must have miscounted again," like forgetting your own child was just some innocent mistake. But Harold saw through her games. He always saw through them. "Margaret," he'd say in that quiet, firm voice of his, "set another place for Candace. She eats with the family." And she would, but not without that look, that cold, calculating stare that promised I'd pay for his protection later when he wasn't around to see. My brothers learned their lessons well from watching their mother. Samuel was the oldest at 16, already built like a man, but with the cruel heart of a child who'd never been taught empathy. Peter and Victor were twins, 14 years old, and mirror images of each other's meanness. Lawrence was 12, and Daniel was 10, closer to my age, but somehow the cruelest of them all, like he had something to prove to his older siblings. They'd accidentally bump into me in the hallway, knocking me into the wall hard enough to leave bruises. They'd hide my school books so I'd get in trouble with my teacher. They'd eat my portion of dinner when Harold wasn't looking, then shrug innocently when he asked why my plate was empty. And Margaret would just sit there, watching it all with this satisfied little smile, like she was conducting an orchestra of cruelty. But Harold? Harold fought for me every single day. I remember one Sunday morning when Margaret told me I couldn't come to church with the family because there wasn't enough room in the car. It was a lie, of course. We had a big Buick that could fit all of us easily. She just didn't want the neighbors seeing me as part of her perfect family portrait. I was maybe 7 years old, standing in my best dress, with my hair in pigtails that Harold had helped me braid, trying not to cry as I watched them prepare to leave without me. Harold stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me standing there. His face went from confusion to understanding to something I'd never seen before. Pure, protective fury. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was so low and dangerous that even my brothers stopped their chattering. "Where is Candace going to sit in the car?" "Well, Harold, you know how crowded it gets with all the boys, and she's mine too." The words came out like steel. "She's my daughter, she lives in this house, she eats at this table, and she goes to church with this family. You'll respect her, Margaret. Do you understand me? You'll respect her, or you'll answer to me." I'd never heard Harold speak to anyone like that before. He was the gentlest man I'd ever known, but in that moment, he became a shield of iron, standing between me and the wolves who shared my last name. Margaret's face went white, then red, then white again. My brothers suddenly found their shoes very interesting to stare at. And you know what? That Sunday, I sat right up front in that Buick, between Harold and the window, watching Wilson's familiar streets roll by while feeling safer than I'd ever felt in my life. But protection like that comes with a price. And even though I was just a child, I could see it in Margaret's eyes every time Harold defended me. She was keeping score, and someday, when he wasn't there to stand between us, I was going to have to pay for every moment of his love. I just didn't know how soon that day would come. You know what's funny about being the outsider in your own family? You start measuring love in the smallest things, like whether someone remembers your birthday, or if there's still food left when it's finally your turn to eat. When you're 8 years old and desperate to belong somewhere, those tiny moments become everything. My birthday was the 15th of October, and Harold never forgot. Not once. He'd wake up early that morning and make me pancakes shaped like flowers, singing "Happy Birthday" in his off-key voice that I loved more than any song on the radio. He'd give me small gifts, a hair ribbon, a coloring book, maybe a candy bar he'd picked up at the company store. Nothing fancy, but they were mine, chosen just for me, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper with more love than most children get with store-bought wrapping paper. But the year I turned 8, something changed. Harold still remembered, still made those flour pancakes, and sang his terrible, wonderful song. But when breakfast was over and he left for work, I realized nobody else in that house even knew what day it was. I spent that entire day waiting for Margaret to surprise me with a cake she'd hidden away, waiting for one of my brothers to slip me a drawing or even just say, "Happy birthday." I waited so long that when Harold came home that evening and asked how my special day had been, I lied and told him it was perfect. I couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes when he realized that without him there to remind them, his wife and sons had forgotten I existed. That night, after Harold tucked me in and told me I was his birthday princess, I heard Margaret's voice drifting from the kitchen where she was cleaning up dinner. 8 years old today, she said to Samuel, her oldest. 8 years of pretending to care about that mistake. That's what she called me when Harold wasn't around. Not Candace. Not even that girl. Just the mistake. Like my entire existence was some error that needed correcting, some problem that would eventually solve itself if she just ignored it long enough. The food situation was worse, though, because it happened every single day. See, Margaret had this system worked out. She'd prepare dinner, usually something simple like beans and cornbread, or maybe some chicken if Harold had been paid that week, and she'd serve Harold first, like a proper wife should. Then the boys would get their portions, starting with Samuel and working down to little Daniel. And then, if there was anything left, if the pot wasn't completely empty, I might get a serving. Most nights, there wasn't anything left. I learned to survive on the meals Harold would sneak me when he came home from work. He'd open that old icebox and pull out whatever he could find. Leftover biscuits, a piece of cornbread, sometimes just a glass of milk and a handful of crackers. He'd sit with me at that kitchen table and watch me eat every bite, making sure I was getting something in my belly before bedtime. "Growing girls need their supper," he'd say, ruffling my hair. "Can't have my princess wasting away to nothing." But Harold couldn't be there for breakfast or lunch. He couldn't see how Margaret would dish up eggs for her 5 sons and then look at me with those cold eyes and say, "Oops, looks like we're all out." He couldn't see how my brothers would leave just enough milk in the pitcher for their cereal, but never enough for mine. He couldn't see how I'd sit at that table, stomach growling, watching them eat while I pretended I wasn't hungry. The worst part wasn't even the hunger, though. The worst part was how normal they all made it seem. How they'd laugh and joke and talk about their day while I sat there invisible, like I was a ghost haunting their dinner table. Samuel would tell stories about his job at the gas station. Peter and Victor would argue about baseball. Lawrence would show off his good grades, and little Daniel would chatter about his friends at school. And I would sit there, quiet as a mouse, hoping that if I was good enough, small enough, invisible enough, maybe tomorrow there would be a plate waiting for me too. But there never was. Because to Margaret, I wasn't part of the family. I was just the mistake that Harold had brought home, the unwanted reminder that her husband's heart had room for someone besides her precious boys. And every empty stomach, every forgotten birthday, every time she called me the mistake when she thought no one was listening, was her way of making sure I never forgot exactly where I stood in her world. Nowhere at all. I thought I knew what fear felt like before Harold died. I thought those hungry nights and forgotten birthdays were the worst things life could throw at an 8-year-old girl. But real terror, real bone-deep terror, doesn't announce itself with shouting or violence. Sometimes it arrives on a quiet Tuesday morning with the sound of a coffee cup hitting the kitchen floor. I was getting ready for school, braiding my own hair because I'd finally learned how, when I heard this strange thud from the kitchen. Not a crash, not a bang, just this soft, final sound that somehow made my stomach drop before my brain even understood why. I ran downstairs in my bare feet, and there he was, Harold, my Harold, slumped over the kitchen table with the Wilson Daily Times spread out in front of him, his coffee seeping across the sports section he'd been reading. "Daddy?" I whispered, because even at 8 years old, something inside me already knew he couldn't hear me anymore. Margaret found us like that, me shaking his shoulder, begging him to wake up, and him already gone to whatever place people go when their hearts just stop beating. She took one look at the scene, and instead of crying or screaming or falling apart like I was, she just stood there for the longest moment with this expression I couldn't read. Then she walked over, checked for a pulse with the same detached efficiency she used to test whether the iron was hot enough, and said 3 words that still echo in my nightmares. "Call the boys." The next few days passed in a blur of casseroles and condolences, neighbors stopping by with covered dishes and hushed voices. Wilson was that kind of town. When someone died, especially someone as well-liked as Harold, the whole community rallied around the family. People kept telling me how sorry they were for my loss, how Harold had loved me so much, how I should be proud to have been his daughter. But through it all, I kept catching these looks between Margaret and my brothers, these quick glances that felt like they were speaking a language I didn't understand but desperately needed to learn. The funeral was held at First Baptist on a gray Thursday that matched exactly how I felt inside. I sat in the front pew wearing the only black dress I owned, one Harold had bought me for Christmas the year before. Margaret sat beside me in her widow's weeds, playing the grieving wife perfectly for the congregation. My brothers sat in a row like stair-steps, Samuel's arm around little Daniel, all of them looking appropriately sad for the crowd. But I felt so alone in that pew that I might as well have been sitting on the moon. After the service, we all filed out to Pine Forest Cemetery, where they dug a hole that seemed impossibly deep for someone who'd once made me feel so safe. I watched them lower Harold's casket into that red North Carolina clay, and I felt like they were burying the only good thing that had ever happened to me along with him. That's when Margaret did something that should have warned me what was coming. As people started to drift away, offering their final condolences and promising to check on us soon, Margaret gathered my brothers around her in a tight little circle. I was standing maybe 10 feet away, still staring at that mound of dirt that covered my whole world, when I heard her voice, low and urgent. "She's ours now," she whispered to Samuel, Peter, Victor, Lawrence, and Daniel. Just 5 words, but the way she said them made my blood freeze. "She's ours now." Not, "She's part of our family now," or "We need to take care of her now," or any of the things a normal mother might say about her newly orphaned daughter. Just, "She's ours now." Like I was some kind of possession that had just changed hands. Like I was livestock at an auction. And the way my brothers looked at each other when she said it? The way their eyes lit up with something I was too young to name but old enough to fear? That's when I knew. Standing there in that cemetery, with dirt still clinging to my good shoes and tears drying on my cheeks, I knew that my life as Harold's protected little princess was over. The ride home from the cemetery was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Margaret sat up front, staring straight ahead with a satisfied expression I'd never seen before. My brothers filled the back seat around me, but instead of the usual shoving and arguing, they were all strangely quiet, waiting. When we pulled into our driveway, Margaret turned around and looked at me with eyes that held no pretense of maternal warmth anymore. The mask she'd worn for Harold's sake for 5 years had finally come off. "Things are going to be different now, Candace," she said, and there was something in her voice that made me want to run. Very different. That was the day I became prey in my own home. That was the day I learned that sometimes the most dangerous hunting happens inside 4 familiar walls, and sometimes the pack that circles you shares your last name. Harold had been gone less than 6 hours, and already I could feel them closing in. The little girl who'd once felt safe enough to sleep with her bedroom door open would never feel safe again. The abuse didn't start with fists. It started with words, small cruelties that felt like paper cuts to my soul. Samuel would accidentally shoulder check me in the hallway. Peter and Victor whispered horrible things about me, just loud enough for me to hear. Lawrence would hide my school books, and little Daniel learned that joining their cruelty was the easiest way to win approval. But it was Margaret who opened the floodgates. 2 weeks after Harold's funeral, I accidentally broke one of her good plates while washing dishes. Margaret stared at those broken pieces, and something dark and hungry shifted in her face. "Boys," she called sweetly, "come see what your sister has done now." They came running like dogs to dinner. Margaret pointed at the broken plate, then at me with soap suds still dripping from my hands. "She's destroyed something precious," Margaret said coldly. "I think she needs to learn what happens when you don't respect other people's belongings." Samuel stepped forward first. At 16, he was bigger than most grown men. He shoved me so hard I flew backward into the cabinet, my head cracking against the wooden door. "But Margaret?" Margaret smiled. "Good," she said. "Make her regret being alive." Those 6 words became our family motto. Margaret didn't just want me hurt. She wanted me to wish I'd never been born. What started with shoving became hitting. Peter would corner me and twist my arm until I cried. Victor perfected the stomach punch that would double me over but never show in my school clothes. And through it all, Margaret watched. Sometimes she'd pull up her chair to get a better view, offering helpful suggestions. "Hit her harder, Samuel. She's not crying yet." Winter brought new tortures. The first time they locked me outside was Lawrence's idea. I'd committed some minor offense, and Margaret pointed to the back door. "Maybe some fresh air will help her think," she said. "Out you go, mistake." I stood on that porch for 6 hours in February, cold, bare feet going numb, watching them through the kitchen window, warm and fed and laughing while I shivered and begged God to either let me back inside or let me die. The bruises got harder to hide. My arms looked painted purple and yellow. At school, I wore long sleeves even on warm days, made excuses for why I couldn't play games that required too much movement. But it wasn't just the fists I feared. It wasn't just the cold nights outside or the constant ache in my body. It was Margaret's laughter. That horrible, delighted sound she'd make when one of them really hurt me. Pure joy, like watching me suffer was better than Christmas morning. That laughter told me this wasn't punishment or discipline. This was entertainment. I was their entertainment, their favorite show, their personal punching bag who happened to live in the same house. And they were just getting started. What started as Samuel's cruelty soon became a family tradition. Like watching your older brother throw a baseball, end of time. Eventually, you want to try it yourself. One by one, my brothers discovered the intoxicating power of having someone smaller, weaker, completely at their mercy. Peter was next. He'd always been quieter than Samuel, more calculating. Where Samuel used brute force, Peter used psychology. He'd whisper threats in my ear when no one was looking, describing in vivid detail what would happen if I ever told anyone what went on in our house. He'd steal my few precious belongings, a hair ribbon Harold had given me, a small doll I'd found in the trash, and hold them hostage until I begged properly. Victor joined in like it was a game. He'd trip me on the stairs, then laugh when I tumbled down, my knees scraping against the wooden steps. He'd pour salt in my water glass, then watch me try to drink it without making a face. He seemed to view my suffering as entertainment, like I was some kind of circus act put on earth for his amusement. Lawrence was 12. Old enough to know better but too eager to please his older brothers to care. He'd hold me down while the others took their turns hitting me. He'd block doorways so I couldn't escape when they decided it was time for another lesson. His participation always felt the most betraying somehow. He was closest to my age. It should have understood what it felt like to be small and scared. But little Daniel? Daniel was the worst of all. At 10 years old, he threw himself into tormenting me with the enthusiasm of someone trying to prove he belonged. He'd spit in my food when Margaret wasn't looking. He'd pinch me under the dinner table until I yelped, then act innocent when Margaret asked what was wrong. He seemed to take particular pleasure in denying me things. If I asked for a glass of water, he'd drink from the pitcher instead. If I reached for a piece of bread, he'd snatch it away and eat it in front of me. Margaret watched it all unfold, like a proud mother whose children had finally learned to play nicely together. She'd nod approvingly when one of them came up with a particularly creative way to hurt me. She'd clap her hands together in delight when I cried. And sometimes, when they'd been especially thorough in their cruelty, she'd reward them with extra dessert or a later bedtime. "Look at my boys," she'd say, beaming at them like they'd just brought home perfect report cards, learning to work together as a family. But it was during one of her quiet moments that she said the words that cut deeper than any punch ever could. I was sweeping the kitchen floor after dinner, trying to stay invisible, when she looked at me with such pure disgust that I actually stepped backward. "She should have never been born," Margaret said, not to me but to the empty air, like she was commenting on the weather. Harold's biggest mistake was bringing that thing into this house. That thing. Not even her anymore. Just that thing. By spring, the violence had become as routine as breakfast. They'd developed a system. Samuel would hold me while Peter hit, or Lawrence would trip me while Victor kicked. They worked together like a well-oiled machine of cruelty, and I was their raw material. Then came that night in May. I remember it was a Thursday because Mrs. Patterson had given us a spelling test that day, and I'd gotten every word right despite being so tired I could barely hold my pencil. I was proud of that perfect score, foolishly thinking it might earn me a moment of peace at home. But when I walked through that front door, I could feel the electricity in the air. Not the kind that comes before a thunderstorm, though that was building outside too, but the kind that comes when predators have been waiting too long to feed. Margaret was sitting in her favorite chair with her knitting, but her hands were still. My 5 brothers were scattered around the living room, pretending to read or play checkers, but their attention was focused entirely on me, like they'd been discussing something while I was gone, making plans. Outside, the first rumbles of thunder began to roll across Wilson. The storm was coming in fast, the way they do in North Carolina, all at once and with a vengeance. "Come here, Candace," Margaret said in that deceptively sweet voice she used when she wanted something. "The boys have been waiting for you." I knew better than to run. Running only made it worse. So I walked into that living room like I was walking to my own execution, which in many ways, I was. Samuel stood up first, blocking the doorway I'd just come through. Peter and Victor flanked me on either side. Lawrence moved behind me, cutting off any hope of escape. Little Daniel just sat there grinning, enjoying the show before it even started. Then they were on me. Not all at once, they'd learned that didn't work as well. One at a time, taking turns, making it last. Samuel shoved me hard enough to send me sprawling across the floor. Before I could get up, Peter grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back. Victor kicked me in the ribs while Lawrence held my legs so I couldn't roll away. And through it all, Margaret sat watching. Not participating, not even speaking, just watching with this cold satisfaction on her face, like she was finally seeing a movie she'd been waiting years to watch. The storm outside was getting worse. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder shook the whole house. But inside that living room, the only sounds were my gasps of pain, my brother's heavy breathing, and Margaret's soft, contented humming. They pinned me down on that worn carpet, 5 boys ranging from 10 to 16 years old, taking turns showing me exactly how powerless I was, how completely I belonged to them, how no one was coming to save me this time. That's when we heard them, sirens in the distance, getting closer. At first, they blended with the thunder, but as they got nearer, there was no mistaking that distinctive wail. My brothers froze. Samuel's hand was raised to hit me again, but he stopped mid-swing. Peter and Victor exchanged worried glances. Lawrence actually stepped away from me, like distance might somehow erase what he'd been doing. The sirens were getting louder, closer, maybe just a few streets away now. And that's when Margaret did something that shattered what little hope I had left in this world. She shot up from her chair like she'd been struck by lightning, her face twisting with panic, and screamed at the top of her lungs. "Stop, the police are here." For one foolish, desperate heartbeat, I thought she was saving me. I thought my mother had finally remembered she was supposed to protect me, that she was telling her sons to stop hurting me because help had arrived. But as I lay there on that floor, bleeding and broken, and still hoping against hope that someone loved me, I realized the terrible truth. She wasn't saving me. She was saving them. Because when you've spent months perfecting the art of child abuse, when you've turned cruelty into a family business, the last thing you want is witnesses. The last thing you want is consequences. Margaret wasn't protecting her daughter. She was protecting her sons, her real children, the ones who mattered. And in that moment, lying on the living room floor of the only home I'd ever known, I finally understood that I was completely, utterly alone. The sirens stopped right outside our house. I could see the red and blue lights flashing through our front windows, painting the living room walls in colors that should have meant salvation. My brothers scattered like roaches when you turn on a light, Samuel to the kitchen, the twins upstairs. Lawrence and Daniel suddenly very interested in a checker game they hadn't been playing 2 minutes before. But I just lay there on that carpet, too beaten down to move, watching Margaret transform herself into someone I barely recognized. She smoothed her dress, patted her hair into place, and when those heavy footsteps climbed our front porch steps, she was ready. The knock came, firm, authoritative, official. Wilson Police Department. We had a call about a disturbance at this address. Margaret opened that door like she was welcoming the preacher for Sunday dinner. Her whole face had changed. Gone was the cold satisfaction I'd seen just moments before, replaced by the warm, concerned expression of a devoted mother. "Oh my goodness, officers," she said, and I swear her voice even sounded different. Higher, sweeter, with just the right touch of confusion. "A disturbance? I can't imagine what you mean. We're just having a quiet evening at home." I could hear 2 male voices, both polite but professional. "Ma'am, we received reports of loud noises, possibly someone in distress. Mind if we take a quick look around?" "Of course not," Margaret replied without missing a beat. "Please, come in. Though I have to say, the only noise we've had tonight is this terrible thunderstorm." As if on cue, thunder rumbled overhead, backing up her story. From where I lay on the living room floor, I could see their boots, heavy black police boots that represented everything I'd been praying for. But I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The beating had taken everything out of me, and Margaret knew it. "These are my boys," she said, her voice full of maternal pride as she gestured toward my brothers. Samuel had returned from the kitchen, looking as innocent as an altar boy. The twins were leaning casually against the stair railing. Lawrence and Daniel were bent over their checkerboard like they'd been playing for hours. "Evening, boys," one of the officers said. "Good evening, sir," they replied in unison, polite as could be. "And this is my youngest," Margaret said, finally acknowledging my existence. "Candace, honey, say hello to the nice policeman." I managed to lift my head, tried to find my voice. This was it, my chance, maybe my only chance. But when I opened my mouth, all that came out was a weak croak. "She's not feeling well tonight," Margaret explained smoothly. "A touch of fever, poor thing. I was just about to put her to bed." One of the officers stepped closer, and for a moment, I thought he might see through her act. But the lighting in that living room was dim, and I was curled up small on the carpet. From his angle, I probably just looked like a tired child. "Everything all right here, miss?" he asked me directly. I looked at Margaret. I looked at my brothers. I saw 5 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting to see what I'd do. And I knew, with the cold certainty that comes from months of education in fear, exactly what would happen to me if I told the truth. "Yes, sir," I whispered. "Just tired." Margaret beamed at me like I was her pride and joy. "Such a good girl," she said. "Always so well behaved." The officers looked around our tidy living room. Margaret was meticulous about keeping up appearances and saw nothing suspicious. Just a normal family on a stormy night. A mother tending to her sick child, boys being boys. "Well, sorry to bother you folks," the first officer said. "Someone must have mistaken the thunder for something else." "Not a problem at all," Margaret replied graciously. "You officers work so hard keeping us all safe. Can I get you some coffee for the road? It's a terrible night to be out in this weather." "That's kind of you, ma'am, but we should get going. You have a good evening now." "You too, officers. Drive safely." And just like that, they were gone. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like the lid of a coffin sealing shut. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Margaret stood by that door for a long moment, listening to their car pull away, making sure they were really gone. Then she turned around, and the mask dropped completely. My brothers were grinning now. Samuel actually chuckled. Peter and Victor high-fived each other. Even little Daniel looked pleased with how well their performance had gone. "Well," Margaret said, her voice back to its usual coldness. That was unfortunate. I suppose we'll have to be more careful about noise levels in the future. She looked down at me, still lying on that floor, and her expression was triumphant. Good girl, Candace. You said exactly the right thing. I'm so proud of how well behaved you were for the nice policeman. But I knew what she really meant. She was proud that I'd learned my place. Proud that I understood exactly what would happen if I ever tried to tell the truth again. That night should have been the end of it. Should have been the moment I gave up completely, accepted that no one would ever believe me, that no one would ever save me. But sometimes, salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Mrs. Patterson had been my third-grade teacher for almost the whole school year, and she'd always been kind to me. Maybe it was because she saw how thin I was getting, or how I flinched when people raised their voices, or how I always wore long sleeves, even when the other children were sweltering in the North Carolina heat. It was 3 weeks after the police visit when she finally said something. I was staying after school to help clean the blackboards, partly because I was a good student, but mostly because I dreaded going home. When she called me over to her desk, "Candace, honey," she said gently, "can you roll up your sleeves for me? I want to see something." My heart started pounding. "Why, Mrs. Patterson?" "Just humor an old teacher, sweetheart, please." With trembling hands, I rolled up the sleeves of my cardigan. The bruises were fading but still visible. Purple and yellow fingerprints around my wrists, long scratches on my forearms from where I'd tried to protect myself. Mrs. Patterson's face went very pale, very still. She'd taught children for 20 years, and she recognized the signs. "Candace," she said quietly, "I need you to tell me the truth. Who did this to you?" And for the first time since Harold died, someone was asking me that question like they actually wanted to hear the answer, like they might actually believe me. So I whispered it. All of it. The beatings, the starvation, the nights locked outside in the cold. Margaret's laughter and her boys' fists, and the police visit that had changed nothing. Mrs. Patterson listened to every word, her face growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she pulled me into the gentlest hug I'd felt since Harold died. "Oh, honey," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. But you're going to be safe now, I promise." The next morning, there was a knock at our door. But this time, it wasn't just police officers. This time, it was social workers, child welfare investigators, people who knew what questions to ask and what signs to look for. And this time, Margaret's performance wasn't going to be enough. When the authorities came back, they brought people who knew what to look for, social workers who'd seen bruises like mine before, investigators who understood that child abuse doesn't always announce itself with screaming and broken bones. Sometimes it hides behind clean houses and polite children and mothers who offer coffee to police officers. They separated us. That was the first thing they did. Took me to one room, my brothers to others, Margaret to the kitchen, where she couldn't coach anyone on what to say. Smart people, these investigators. They'd done this before. Samuel cracked first. 16 years old and tough as nails when he was beating up a little girl, but put him in a room with 2 stern-faced adults asking pointed questions, and he fell apart like wet cardboard. He tried to minimize it at first. Said I was clumsy. Said I bruised easily. Said I was always making up stories for attention. But they kept pressing. Kept asking about specific injuries, specific incidents. And eventually, Samuel started telling the truth. Not because he felt guilty. I don't think Samuel ever felt guilty about anything in his whole life, but because he was scared and confused and smart enough to realize that lying to government officials was a different kind of trouble than beating up his sister. Peter and Victor tried to stick together, the way twins do. Told the same story word for word, like they'd rehearsed it. But their story didn't match Samuel's, and it didn't match the evidence written all over my body. When the investigators pointed out the inconsistencies, the twins started blaming each other. Victor said it was all Peter's idea. Peter said Victor was the violent one. Pretty soon they were throwing each other under the bus so fast it would have been funny if it hadn't been my life they were talking about. Lawrence surprised everyone by telling the truth right from the start. Maybe he was tired of carrying the secret, or maybe at 12 years old he was still young enough to believe that honesty mattered. He told them about the nights I was locked outside, about how Margaret would encourage them to hit harder, about how they'd all learn to work together to hurt me. Little Daniel was the hardest to break. 10 years old, and already a practiced liar, he stuck to his story that I was accident-prone, that I fell down a lot, that nobody in the family would ever hurt me on purpose. But children aren't as good at lying as they think they are, and eventually, the contradictions in his story piled up like snow. Margaret? Margaret was magnificent in her fury. She denied everything, of course. Claimed I was a troubled child who hurt herself for attention. Said Harold had spoiled me rotten, and that she'd been trying to teach me discipline and respect. She painted herself as the long-suffering stepmother, trying to raise an ungrateful, mentally unstable child. But the evidence was overwhelming. Not just the bruises and scars on my body, but the testimony of my brothers, the careful documentation by the social workers, even statements from neighbors who'd heard things they'd chosen to ignore for too long. Samuel was 17 by the time everything went to court. Too old for juvenile detention, but young enough that the judge took his age into consideration. He got probation and mandatory counseling, though I heard years later that he'd been arrested multiple times for assault. Some people never learn that using your fists isn't the answer to life's problems. Peter and Victor were sent to a boys' home for 6 months. They came out claiming they'd learned their lesson, but Victor ended up in prison before he turned 25 for beating his girlfriend nearly to death. Peter moved away from Wilson and, as far as I know, stayed out of serious trouble. Sometimes change is possible, I guess. Lawrence actually seemed genuinely sorry for what he'd done. The judge gave him community service and counseling, and from what I heard through the Wilson Gossip Network, he grew up to be a decent man. Married a nice girl, had children of his own, and by all accounts treated them with kindness. Maybe there was hope for him after all. Daniel was the youngest, just 10 when it all came out. The court was gentle with him, recognizing that he'd been following the lead of his older brothers and his mother. But I wonder sometimes what kind of man he became, whether he ever understood the weight of what he'd participated in. As for Margaret, she was charged with child abuse, neglect, and endangering the welfare of a minor. The prosecutor painted a picture of a woman who'd systematically tortured an innocent child for years, who'd turned her own sons into accomplices in her cruelty. She got 18 months in prison and lost custody of Daniel, who went to live with relatives. 18 months, for years of torture, for turning 5 boys into monsters, for destroying whatever childhood innocence I might have had left. 18 months seemed like nothing compared to the lifetime sentence she'd given me. But you know what? It was enough. Not because the punishment fit the crime, but because it meant someone had finally looked at my broken body and my broken spirit and said, "This matters. What happened to you matters." I left Wilson the day I turned 18, packed everything I owned into a single suitcase, and caught the first Greyhound bus heading anywhere else. I never went back. Never visited Harold's grave, never drove down the familiar streets of my childhood, never looked back to see if the house on Elm Street was still standing. Some people might think that's sad, turning your back on your hometown like that. But Wilson was never really my home. Home is supposed to be where people love you, where you feel safe, where you belong. Wilson was just the place where I learned to survive. I made a life for myself somewhere else. Found people who loved me without conditions, who never raised their hands in anger, who proved to me that family isn't always about blood. I learned what it felt like to sleep through the night without nightmares, to flinch when someone moves too fast, to trust that when someone says they care about you, they might actually mean it. Now, at 83, when people ask me about my childhood, I usually just say it was difficult and change the subject. Most people don't need to know the details of what humans are capable of doing to each other. Most people couldn't handle the truth, even if I told them. But tonight feels different. Tonight feels like the right time to finally say it all out loud. The police did find out the truth, but only after years of pain. Justice came slowly, imperfectly, but it came. And with it came something I'd never expected, the strength to keep living. The understanding that surviving something terrible doesn't make you terrible. That being broken doesn't mean you can't heal. It took me decades to learn that Harold's love was real, even if it couldn't protect me forever. That Mrs. Patterson's kindness mattered, even though it came too late to prevent the worst of it. That the little girl who endured all that pain and fear was stronger than anyone, including herself, ever imagined. I'm 83 years old now, and I've lived more years in peace than I ever did in terror. That's something, isn't it? That's victory, of a sort. You know, for 76 years, I kept this story locked away in the deepest part of my heart. I told myself it was too ugly to share, too painful to speak out loud, too shameful to burden others with. I convinced myself that silence was safer, that forgetting was healing, that some truths were better left buried. But I was wrong. Because while I was staying quiet, protecting the memory of people who never protected me, other children were suffering in silence too. Other little girls were going to bed hungry and waking up afraid. Other families were hiding their cruelty behind closed doors and polite smiles, counting on the fact that nobody wants to believe such terrible things happen in ordinary houses on ordinary streets. Silence protects abusers. It always has. It gives them permission to keep hurting, keep destroying, keep turning children into victims and victims into statistics. Every time we look the other way, every time we choose not to ask the hard questions, every time we accept the easy explanations, we become complicit in that silence. But stories like mine? Stories told with truth and courage and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving the unsurvivable? These stories can finally break that silence. If my words tonight have touched something in your heart, if they've reminded you that every child deserves protection and love and safety, then I'm asking you to do something for me. Subscribe to Grandparents' Archives, because we old folks have stories that need telling. Stories that might sound impossible, but are heartbreakingly real. Stories that might just save someone else from walking the dark path I did. More importantly, if you know a child who seems too quiet, too careful, too eager to please, pay attention. If you see bruises that don't match the explanations, if you notice someone always wearing long sleeves in summer or flinching when voices get raised, speak up. Be the Mrs. Patterson that child needs. Be the voice they can't find for themselves. Because the truth has a way of coming out eventually. It always does. But how much suffering happens while we wait for that truth to surface? How many children endure years of pain because the adults in their lives chose comfort over courage? At 83, I don't have many years left to tell my story. But you do. You have years to listen, to watch, to speak up when something doesn't seem right. You have the power to be part of the solution instead of part of the silence. Use it, please. Use it for every child who can't speak for themselves, for every little girl or boy who's counting on adults to do the right thing, for every story that's still waiting to be told. Because in the end, we're all just human beings trying to find our way through this difficult world. And the only way we get through it together is by refusing to let the most vulnerable among us face their darkness alone. That's my story. That's my truth. And now, it's my gift to you. The gift of knowing that survival is possible, that justice can prevail, and that sometimes the most broken people become the strongest voices for change. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for helping make sure that silence never wins again.